That was no question about it, an unsettling and a game where Illinois lost more than just a game uh, last night in Washington. But welcome back to the Illini Audible podcast. My name is Saeed Bravo. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the pod. As always, I really appreciate it. And thank you for bearing with me and thank you for remaining with us tonight. As obviously, I took a bit of a hiatus from the podcast. Obviously, last week was a bye week, but we came back, obviously, still covering this Illinois football team. Unfortunately, we do have to talk about a loss. We do have to talk about the magnitude of this game, what it meant in the micro, what it means in the macro, and obviously cover all of everything in between because a lot of really awful things happened inside of this game. And it's really disheartening if you're an Illinois fan. For you guys, it is it, one of the all time the time I've been covering this team, probably one of the all time disappointments. You pair that up with the game at Indiana, although retrospectively you look at it and you say Indiana is one of those better teams, but let's stick to Washington. Obviously, the magnitude of this loss is, and the reason I say losing more than just a game, and we'll just get right into the big picture of it because that's where my brain always goes. And that's the fact that any chance of any hope of even being in a conversation about the college football playoff and making a bid to get to that point, it's over. It's gone. You everybody understood, and it was no secret that you had to win out the rest of this season to even sniff at a chance. And because of what Ohio State is, and the fact that you did somewhat of a decent job competing against Ohio State, granted at home, and coupled with the magnitude of the what crapping of the bed that was at Indiana. But then you had the argument of Indiana is among the top two teams in the country, and guess who's number one? Ohio State. So there was room for Illinois to make somewhat of an argument that, hey, this is, you got to give us a chance here. It's over, man. I mean, I understand Washington is a great program in and of itself. Respectively, it's a good program. But to have a chance, you have to be able to travel, man. It's the second year in a row where Illinois goes off to the West Coast and frankly doesn't compete and doesn't stand a chance. Obviously, Oregon was obviously number one at the time as well. But it's something that at some point, if you do want to have those aspirations, which Illinois, specifically Brett Bielema, and everybody inside that building wants to sell you on, this program has the potential. We want you to come to the stadium. We want you to be here. We want you to support Illini Athletics because we think that this program can aspire to the next level. Well, so far, there is none to justify that. There simply isn't. It's unfortunate to say, and I hate to say it, but it is just the case here with this team. And the more you think about it, the worse it gets because obviously a lot of the reason for why a lot of people had their stock up on Illinois was because of how many returning starters or how many returning pieces were going to come back into this program. And you look at the way that a lot of those pieces, specifically the depth, has played up until this point in the season, and it is disappointing. And we'll get into the nitty gritty of that because I do have a lot of thoughts on the defense. I do have a lot of thoughts, though, also on offense because, yes, I think this team in and of itself, the expectations were there in my head and also in a lot of you guys' head. I know there was a lot of people online wanting this Illinois team, believing that this Illinois team could be at a point where if they went out, they could quote unquote run the. No, they don't. They were not going to run anything. Okay, Illinois was not that program. Guess what? They just wasn't. And Brett Bielema always harps on the idea that they want people to keep coming to the stadium. Obviously, that's a given. But he advocates a lot for his own program, which is great to see. But to a certain extent, this team is just not that program. It's not that team. In 2025, it isn't. And it's starting to become a pattern. The way that I look at it from the outside looking in, you had and this is just me. Bear with me. I know this is a Washington quote unquote post game pod coming in the next day, but just to unpack a couple of my thoughts, 2022 or excuse yeah 2022, you have a pretty good season, that the best season up until Brett Bielema's tenure, that you had building up until that point. What was it, 8-5? You go to the Relia Quest Bowl, you feel really good about the team. The next season, regression. I know that it was hard to replicate 2022's the defense that they had that year, but there was total regression. You ended the year, 500, no bowl game. All right, 2024, you have that Citrus Bowl win. You have that season. It looks like you have your quarterback. You have huge playmakers. You have personnel that returns the following season. You have a defensive coordinator, we'll get into that, and an offensive coordinator that opt to get back into the game the next season. You modify your staff a little bit. You feel good about the direction of this program. Well, it turns out that the program hasn't really made another a step above that. At least that's not what they've shown throughout this year, because no question has Illinois had the opportunities. Now you could argue 4 times. You count the USC game, which I will count. It's pretty good to win. The Washington game, the Ohio State game, Indiana game, to say, hey, you can look at these victories, however many of those games you win. Look at these wins, and you can feel good about them. You've only won one of those games out of those 4. That is not good enough for how much money this team has invested in their program, and it's not indicative of what the program higher ups want for this team, the vision for this team. It just isn't that. My concern as well, and you can count USC as an exception in right now, but as I said a couple weeks ago, now it's starting to feel like Illinois is just one of those teams that capitalizes on teams that are on their heels, that teams that are on their way to irrelevance. Let's look at it that way. And I go back all the way to the Kansas game. I know that was a top 25 win. I know that there's a lot to be made of Brett Bielema's top 25 wins, a lot of top 25 wins, which is great. But you look at where those programs are after being top 20, after being beaten by Illinois. They're on a downward spiral. A lot of those programs. You look at that Kansas game last season, no longer irrelevant. Nebraska, top 25. You beat them. Good win at the time. Never researched that season back in the 2020, the top 25. This season, they bounced in for 1 week, and then they immediately lost to Minnesota, I think it was. But you have that. You had a couple games this season too. The way that I look at it is that Illinois just isn't that team that is going to make a statement against a team that is firmly in the top 25. I know they did beat USC, but so far that's been the only one that I look at and I feel really good about. And even then, it was a 1-score win. Obviously, it's tough to win those kinds of games, but that is my thought on that. And listen, for Illinois, it's really, really hard now to see, obviously, to see a future where this team gets back into that aspiration of that. It's just going to continue to be an uphill climb. The schedule only gets, quote unquote, easier. And then we'll get into really the optics of that, because optically, you can say from afar, that this schedule gets lighter. I would beg to differ, but that's what pundits are gonna say. And that's not where my head's at, but that's what pundits are gonna say. The thing that I go back to again, and I'll just keep talking because this is kind of where my head's at, and I know I'm jumbling a lot, but keep it with me for a second. I don't believe that Illinois will be able to get back on that. It'd be great if they can win out, but listen, I go back to that game against Minnesota last year. It's similar personnel, not the same. Obviously, I know that 50% of the roster has changed, but I still think that a lot of really of the same team is still here based on coaches, based on half of that personnel. The quarterback, which is so much of what a team is, the offensive line, a lot of defensive pieces, especially the younger pieces. That's a game you should have won. That is a game you should have won, and you lost that. I know this is a Washington postgame pod, so let's get back to that. I'm sorry I went on a whole tangent there, but it felt necessary. I'll just remove that from the rundown. I was going to talk about that last, but I just did that first. So, in the micro, yeah, the defense was totally out of sorts, not good, and we have to talk about how much lack of pressure there was on the quarterback, young Damon Williams, who was impressive. What I go back to is the fact that this 19-year-old kid had just came off probably his worst game of the season, throwing 3 interceptions at Michigan, and you follow that up with no pressure on the quarterback when he's playing at home, and he makes you pay for it with his legs, with his arm, and you just seemingly can't stop the kid. That's just, I don't know how that turns out to be the case, because you should be able to get to the quarterback. It felt like a lot of the times, I wrote this down, is that none of the pass rushers seemed to pose a threat at all. There was so many times inside of that game, excuse me, when your pass rushers were with the offensive linemen and there was no lateral movement. There was none of that. And young Damon Williams operated in a clean pocket for the majority of that game. One of the more impressive stats that is easy to look at, that I cherry picked, to be frank, 0 tackles for loss and 0 sacks through the first 3 quarters, most of the game until garbage time, really. That can't happen. That just cannot happen. And it did. And that, I understand that Washington is a good team in themselves. They're a respectable program. They're a good program. I think they should have snuck into the top 25 this past weekend. They didn't. But still, if you want to be a team that justifies your rhetoric about potentially sniffing into the CFP conversation, it has to be better than what it is. It's over. It's just fine. Illinois, like I said weeks before, they're going to be a bowl team again. And that's a standard. That's still a better standard to adhere to than what it used to be years ago. But obviously, you want to keep climbing. You want to keep pushing the bar higher. This season is just going to be one of those seasons where I think Illinois doesn't really get much better than what it was last year. It might be the same, might be a little worse. Still better than what it was years ago. Anyways, not to get too off my out of shorts myself. The secondary was also struggling quite a bit. I know that there were a lot of times where Illinois just wasn't able to get to the quarterback. And when you have a relatively young secondary, a secondary that is operating under no Xavier Scott, then you can't do that to your secondary, in my opinion, because a lot of those guys are really young. A lot of those guys haven't had all the reps that you would hope, or are either depth pieces. And let me give you some specifics. Obviously, a guy like Jaheim Clark, I think, can hold his own. And he didn't have such a great game, but where I point to specifically is the likes of Tanner Heckel, who has been thrust into one of the most important positions on this team, direct replacement, I believe, to Xavier Scott. I might be reading that wrong, but forgive me for that. But he had to play significant amount of snaps, 52 snaps throughout this past game. You know who else had to see some action? Tyler Strain, who usually doesn't really see all that much action. His best game this season was against Duke. There's a significant gap between non-conference and conference this season. You know that Duke team is pretty okay, but you got to win conference games, and it's been hard. I think Torrey Cox had usually when the cameras aren't really, because I was watching the broadcast. Usually when the cameras aren't on, you're a defensive back means you're doing a good job. It's just there's moments inside of that game that you can't help but feel bad for these defensive backs, a lot of the corners, nickels, because of the fact that you just weren't getting any help no one was getting to the quarterback. And then the quarterback was able to use his legs and just get out of the pocket and do really whatever he wanted to. So Illinois was not just felt just unprepared to live up to the challenge of what this Washington offense wants. Denzel Boston is really good. And I understand that he, as good as he might be, 10 catches for 153 yards and long of 28. That just, for an Illinois defense that is this experienced, and I know I've been highlighting a lot of the younger guys, but once again, when you do have a lot of these guys like Kenena Odeluga, who did not get significant snaps, I guess Leon Lowry, a guy like Gabe Akis, a guy like Angelo McCullum, the expectation is that they should be able to do that. They're not. You could argue that you should give a guy like Tanner Heckel the benefit of the doubt. A guy like Matt Grossetich, the benefit of the doubt. But when you have guys like that, it's just you have to play better than what they did. James Cruz had himself close to an interception. That could have been a turning point in this instead of that game. At the point, it was early, but there was just so many moments inside of this game where you felt like hopeless. And so that part of it really, really stinks. To put it into perspective, right? Let's put everything into perspective. Washington, the defense, the Illinois defense allowed this Washington team, to score on nearly every possession. They only forced 1 3 and out. but they had so many opportunities to make plays, and they made you pay. There's something to be said, and there's 100% reasons. There's 100%. I I understand why there will be a lot of arrows pointing to, a lot of fingers pointing to defensive coordinator Aaron Henry. At this point in his tenure, it feels like he should be better than what he actually is up until this point. There's no question about it. He's in his third season as defensive coordinator. It feels like he should understand, not just the magnitude of the game, but like how to game plan for a quarterback that's that young. That is a 19-year-old kid who had just come off probably his worst start of the season. And not only that, it's not like we just found out that Xavier Scott was going to miss the game. We've known that. He's been gone for quite a while. There needs to be I feel like there might need to be more of an understanding for why, or as to how to use the personnel that they have. It's frustrating for fans. I think it's frustrating for everyone. But obviously, Brett Bielema said after the game that he would get more involved in the defensive game planning moving forward. That is just a product of the necessity of what's at stake now. But it sure feels like they should have been more prepared, having had, 2 weeks to prepare for a singular opponent, and understanding where your personnel was at the time, understanding which one of your guys was going to be healthy and ready for this game. That part of it is disappointing. It just is. And not really much else to say on the defense, because really it felt like anything and everything was going wrong. They did whatever they want on offense. Washington did. Illinois did not stop anything. So, not going to say much more on that. The offense was more competitive than the defense. Obviously, they had 2 solid drives to start the game, which was encouraging. You felt like, okay, once the half was kind of winding down and Illinois was having that 17-14 lead at the half, the thought was that, hey, this is going to be a blowout. It's going to have to be Illinois' offense that's going to have to carry the load. Well, second half, just a totally different story on offense, and you didn't feel encouraged for most of what you saw. There were a couple snaps inside of that game where I thought that the offensive line wasn't good in pass protection. There were a couple mistakes on a couple guys. For the most part, I thought the offensive line played pretty okay because Washington was sending a significant amount of pressure, significant amount of blitz. And maybe that's just a product of Illinois wasn't sending any blitz ever. So it felt like Washington did it so many more times. Let me start with the positive, since they were encouraging to a certain extent inside of this game. Obviously, the connection between Luke Altmaier and Hank Beatty is still there. It has been there the entire season, and it's probably going to continue throughout the rest of the season, and is the shining point of this offense. Cole Rusk had significant more production throughout the course of this game, and you saw that today. You saw that last night. 4 receptions, 56 yards, a long of 27. You felt encouraged about what you've seen with him. Colin Dixon still putting a solid amount of production, but everybody else in the receiving category is stalled. The part that isn't discouraging about that is because Colin Dixon and Hank Beatty, as good as they might be, physically, they're not the biggest guys on the team. For that, you would like a Jabo, Justin Bowick, or Hudson Clement to add that element to this program. Well, it feels like a lot of those guys have stalled out in throughout the course of this season. You felt encouraged about what you've seen with Justin Bowick, him being a red zone target. But beyond the first couple games, non-conference games, and maybe the first conference game, or no, that would have been Indiana. You beyond USC, then you're just he it he hasn't really been a factor. That you've used him to draw DPIs, which I think is a great way to use a guy that physical, but there hasn't been much more. There has not been much more to get those weapons involved. And I think it's not about not getting them involved. The reasons they're probably not as involved is because there's still things inside of practice. Obviously, we don't get access to practices, but there is probably to me it from what I could tell, it's probably a result of what they've seen on the practice field that they don't that at least Barry Lunny, I think, and this is my opinion. I'm not reporting anything, strictly my opinion, just by inferring, reading between the lines of everything they tell us throughout the weeks. I think Barry Lunny doesn't trust a couple of those other guys as much as Hank Beatty, who's been really reliable, Colin Dixon, who has been solid throughout this season. Now Cole Rusk. Those other guys are receiving targets. There are times where he sprinkles them in, but for the most part, it's like they're never going to be a go-to guy like what Pat Bryant was last season. And obviously, that is also a factor of this offense. Hank Beatty, great football player, just smaller. And that's just the reality of it. I think the quarterback had not a great game. 199 yards, 22 for 34 passing attempts, 2 touchdown passes, 2 interceptions. Could have been much more. Could have been 4. And if it wasn't for the refs kind of having at the backs of Illinois, because what was it? Roughing the passer was definitely pretty objectively there, I think. No, actually, the roughing the passer call was pretty absurd because I those are the parts where if we were fans of anyone else, if people were you were looking at that as an objective football watcher, you would have squinted a little bit. You would have raised an eyebrow and said, well, "How is that a pass roughing the passer?" There were a couple of defensive pass interference calls that I thought were also questionable. So you had help. You had help to a certain extent. Illinois did. I think it could have been much more than two interceptions. But there was moments where Luke Altmaier made the right decision, getting rid of the ball, dumping it off. Those interceptions were killer, though. Trying to fit in a ball into a really, really small window. If you're going to do that, you have to make it a dart, and it wasn't. And you saw Washington making them pay. So overall, just awful day for Illinois. Awful production for Illinois. You feel not good about this team going forward. And the reason, I know it's such a week-to-week game, but listen, man, when you lose a game of that magnitude, a game that means so much, that it's not encouraging to see at all. And so you worry about it. Just really quick, the network thing, commentary, it was not good. Like Jake Butt did not make me smarter as a football watcher. They were trying to be nice too on a couple comments, but it was not good, man. Like it was just not. There was only really one moment in which I thought, oh, this comment adds a lot of value to my viewing experience, and overall, I just didn't feel like I learned much. So that was something as well. But as we look ahead to the schedule, obviously, optics, it looks like an easy schedule. Listen, man, I go back to that Minnesota game last year where Illinois probably should have won that game. I know PJ Flack's a good coach, but Illinois is supposed to abide by certain standards nowadays. That standard wasn't met on that day, and I really don't feel good about Illinois winning what, four straight games to end the season. You got a Rutgers team that's coming off kind of a what you would argue to be kind of a prolific comeback win over Purdue. I know Purdue isn't really that good, but that's a factor. You go to Wisconsin, Maryland can be a really solid team. Then you have Northwestern that has had a knack of beating Illinois or competing against an in-state rival. Last time Northwestern was in Memorial Stadium, they came out victorious. So we'll see how everything kind of unfolds as the season continues. But obviously, you don't feel good about it the rest of the way. With that being said, thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the pod. I really appreciate it. Thank you for bearing with me. Because I know I had a lot of thoughts that I just spewed out there, and it's been a while since I've done this. We'll be back with more content, so please follow along. Subscribe, rate, review if you so please, and peace.